Why exactly do you think PTSD can happen?
Again, there's a lot of research on this. Some of the factors that have been identified suggest that if certain conditions are present, it's more likely that someone will develop PTSD. Some of these conditions include a man-made versus a natural disaster. More likely to have PTSD if the disaster is man-made. If the disaster is either deliberate or accidental, you're more likely to get PTSD if it's a deliberate event versus an accidental one. Then there are issues like the scale of the traumatic event, whether a loved one is involved, how close you were to it. So there are a number of factors which would suggest when it's more likely or less likely. And again, if you've got good social support, that might help you. A lot of people encouraging you around you versus perhaps trying to deal with it all alone in a foreign country, it might be a lot harder.
How is PTSD cured?
There are a number of different psychological treatments that are available. Cognitive behavior therapy, I think, has shown from research to be the most effective, and within cognitive behavior therapy there are a number of specific treatments that are used. It probably gets quite complicated. There's something called eye movement desensitization reprocessing, EMDR. There's another one called EFT, emotional freedom technique. There's something called NLP, neuro-linguistic programming. So there are a number of therapeutic approaches within cognitive behavior therapy that can be very effective for this disorder.
Is this something that friends, families or relatives could necessarily pick up on, or would they actually notice if someone close to them was suffering from PTSD?
Certainly it's not always the case that it's recognized. I remember giving a talk to a number of people who were working in the aviation field, and I was describing what post-traumatic stress was. Afterwards, one of them came up to me and said his wife had had a car accident about 2 years previously, and she was still going through a number of the symptoms that I'd mentioned, but none of them had realized that this was post-traumatic stress disorder. She hadn't seen her GP about it. I think it's a really important thing that the person does go to see the GP if they've had a very unpleasant event and are experiencing these sorts of symptoms. Now, what friends and family can do, I think, is encourage the person to get help. That's a really important one. Be understanding if the person is extra irritable and forgetful, because that's going to be how they are. That's part of the condition. For the person themselves to have lower expectations of how they're going to manage things. They won't be concentrating so well. To maybe be in a slightly quieter environment, because you're likely to have an increased sensitivity to noise, an increased sensitivity to light. So just to get lots of rest, eat well, not try and drown your sorrows in alcohol, and accept the fact that you probably will have disturbed sleep for quite a while, but being able to tell oneself these symptoms are normal and accepting them is one of the ways that they can pass quicker. There's another type of therapy also, which is part of cognitive behavior therapy, called mindfulness, and that again is learning how to accept things and live in the present, and can be very, very useful.
Do you think there's any stigma attached to PTSD? For example, people saying to sufferers, get over it, pull yourself together. Is this something that can be quite common?
Again, I think you're absolutely right, linked to the misunderstanding of the fact that the person is not being silly, is not being weak. They genuinely, if they're going back to the spot where something nasty has happened, they are likely to feel completely overwhelmed, and therefore the sensitivity to that and the ability to coax the person through it is very important. In the old days, when soldiers suffered from what used to be called battle shock or shell shock, it was suggested at that time that they might even deserve shooting. That certainly would not be the answer.
That's lovely. Thank you very much for that, Elaine. Is there anything else you'd like to add to this?
Yes, when we were talking earlier about the different elements that make it more likely someone will develop PTSD. One of the ones that's been highlighted is whether a person feels they're actually in some way the cause or to blame for whatever the event was. And if they take it that it's their fault, then it's more likely that they will probably get the symptoms of PTSD. There's also an issue around the way they think they responded to it. Did they just save themselves, maybe harm other people in the process, or were they in the role of helping others? And of course, if they were just looking after themselves and think they might have trampled others in the process, when they're reliving it in their minds, it's more likely they might develop post-traumatic stress disorder. The other thing is that very often, if the problem's gone on for a long, long period of time, over a number of years, they may eventually go to their doctor complaining of non-specific symptoms like a headache, sleep difficulties, irritability, depression, tension, might be problems in their relationships with their partner or their friends or colleagues, maybe even substance abuse, and therefore it's useful to have a trained professional who can ask the person the right questions so that they can then begin to uncover something that's happened that they didn't realize was linked to how they're feeling now. Because of course, from their point of view, they very often don't want to talk about it, because talking about it brings back all the unpleasant thoughts and feelings. There are some very effective treatments that are available. A person doesn't have to just put up in silence and live in misery and make the life for themselves and their family unpleasant. A person can definitely overcome this difficulty. You can either go and seek help through your GP and the National Health Service. There's also private therapy available. For instance, the work that I do, if anybody wanted to contact me, I'm available by email, elaine@freedomtofly.biz, B-I-Z for zebra, or the website www.freedomtofly, all one word, .biz. And there are a number of registers of chartered psychologists and other specialists in the field of psychological problems. There are a number of self-help books. In fact, the third of the trilogy that I've written for the Dummies series, there's one on anxiety for dummies, depression, overcoming depression for dummies, and just published at the end of June 2009 is the Anxiety and Depression Workbook for Dummies, and all of that, they include self-help exercises on how to overcome various anxiety disorders and problems with depression.